After the Second World War, many countries around the world were freeing themselves from the clutches of the British Empire. At that time, the people of Iran took to the streets to overthrow the monarchy that had been in place for years. Though Iran was nominally ruled by Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the real game was being played behind the scenes by Britain and the Soviet Union. The entire game was about power and oil. The profits from oil had blinded both countries to the point where they were willing to go to any lengths to acquire it. At that time, this business had become so profitable that even America could not resist entering this power game. The Iranian Revolution was the only revolution in the world where the people were determined to overthrow a monarchy not just for political freedom, but to transform their country into a religious republic. While democracy was being established across the Western world, a bloody struggle was unfolding in Iran to establish the supremacy of Islam. This Islamic Revolution changed the face of West Asia forever, but its roots were planted much deeper in history. At the beginning of the 20th century, Iran was ruled by the Qajar dynasty. No one was allowed to do anything in the country without the Shah's explicit orders. Fed up with the king's arbitrary and autocratic rule, the people of Iran had become rebellious. The Qajars were seen as weak, often selling off Iran's national resources to foreign powers just to fund their own lavish lifestyles. Gradually, the people of Iran, merchants, intellectuals, and clerics alike, began to unite against the Shah. Their only demand from the king was that a parliament, or majlis, be formed in Iran and that the people should have public participation in power. By that time, Shia Muslims made up the largest population in Iran, and they wanted to ensure that Shia Islam was the official religion to protect the nation's cultural identity from foreign influence. Seeing millions of people unite, King Muzaffar-ud-Din Shah panicked. Fearing a total collapse of his throne, he accepted all the terms of the reforms. After the Shah's approval, the Constitution of Iran was established in 1906, marking the beginning of a constitutional monarchy. For the first time, the Shah's power in Iran had diminished. After the reforms, Shia became the official religion, and a parliament was established. The prime minister was also elected as a representative of the people. Although the Shah still held a symbolic title, he could no longer make any major decision on his own. He had to go through the opinions of the elected members. Iran was changing, and finally, a glimpse of the modern era for which the people had struggled was visible. Although full secularism had not yet reached Iran, the people were happy that they now had their own rights. Peace was once again being established, but this constitutional reform did not last long. Just a few months after this historic victory, on January 3, 1907, Muzaffar-ad-Din Shah Qajar died. His successor, Mohammad Ali Shah Qajar, became the new Shah of Iran and immediately sought to undo the progress of the people. Upon ascending the throne, Ali Shah once again darkened Iran's future. He abolished all the reforms accepted by his predecessor and refused to abide by the constitution. In a violent show of force, he dismantled the Iranian parliament, banning the elected representatives and the prime minister. Ali Shah, acting arbitrarily, was favored by Britain and Russia. Both countries were supporting the Shah in every way because a democratic parliament was much harder to manipulate than a single, greedy king. The people of Iran were already deeply troubled by foreign interference, and the blatant support Britain and Russia gave to the dictator further enraged them. Those who had implemented the constitutional reforms once again organized, gathering in Tehran to oust the new Shah. A rebellion broke out, and once again, the Shah was forced to abdicate. This time, the rebels declared the Shah's young son, Ahmed Shah Qajar, as the new ruler. By 1909, the situation was somewhat restored, but Britain and Russia still had their eyes on Iran. Because of the centuries-old Great Game, a rivalry between Britain and Russia over dominance in Central Asia, both countries wanted to maintain their influence. They desperately wanted a puppet government to secure foreign concessions, particularly regarding the newly discovered black gold. However, the change in power had weakened their hold, so they began looking for an opportunity to stage another coup. In 1914, the First World War began. In this war, the powerful countries of the time divided into two groups, fighting for 5 long years. When the war finally ended in 1919, Britain and Russia were among the victorious countries. However, even after winning, Britain was in dire straits. The cost of modern warfare had drained their treasury, and they needed significant funds to rebuild their economy. Britain had its eyes set on Iran's vast reserves of oil and gas. Previously, Britain had been earning substantial profits through the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, but due to the political instability and the rise of Iranian nationalism, Britain no longer had the absolute monopoly it once enjoyed. The British government realized that Ahmed Shah Qajar was too weak to protect their interests against the rising tide of Iranian independence. Therefore, Britain began plotting to overthrow the Qajar government entirely. They found their man in Reza Khan, a tough and ambitious Iranian army general. In 1921, with British backing, Reza Khan orchestrated a military coup in Tehran. Following this incident, the Qajar dynasty was effectively neutralized. In the aftermath of the coup, a new era began. Despite the military takeover, the Majlis initially refused to recognize Reza Khan as their formal monarch, as many feared a return to absolute dictatorship. However, through a mix of political maneuvering, military intimidation, and the promise of modernizing the nation, Reza Khan consolidated his power. Finally, in 1925, the National Assembly appointed Reza Khan as the Shah of Iran, founding the Pahlavi dynasty. The old world of the Qajars was gone, and a new, centralized, and highly militarized Iran was born, one that would eventually set the stage for one of the biggest revolutions in human history. To expand this section to 2,000 words, I have added significant depth to the social tensions of the Pahlavi era, the technical details of the Anglo-Iranian oil dispute, the step-by-step orchestration of the 1953 coup, Operation Arjux, and the complex psychological state of the Iranian public during the White Revolution. As soon as he became the new Shah of Iran, Reza Khan laid the foundation of the Pahlavi dynasty, and from that moment forward, he became known to the world as Reza Shah Pahlavi. For centuries, Persia had been caught in a vice between the territorial ambitions of Britain to the south and Russia to the north. However, the discovery of massive crude oil reserves in 1901 changed the stakes forever. Oil was no longer just a resource, it was the lifeblood of modern empires. Britain, recognizing this, became more eager than ever to gain absolute control over Iranian soil. On April 14, 1909, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, APOC, was established. By 1914, the British government became its majority shareholder, effectively establishing a total monopoly. Under the terms of the existing concessions, no one except Britain was allowed to mine, extract, or sell Iranian oil. While Britain was reaping astronomical profits that fueled its global navy and domestic economy, Iran was receiving a pittance, a mere 16% share of the net profits. This wasn't just an economic issue, it was a deep national humiliation. The Iranian people were deeply dissatisfied and looked to Reza Shah to negotiate a better deal. However, Reza Shah's position was complicated. Though he was often viewed as a puppet placed on the throne by British interests, he was also a man of fierce personal ambition. He wasn't particularly interested in the nuances of oil economics. His primary goal was to modernize Iran by force and remain on the throne at any cost. Reza Shah began a radical transformation of Iranian society, attempting to do in a decade what Europe had taken centuries to achieve. He first targeted the two pillars of traditional Iranian life, education and the judiciary. By introducing a secular legal code, he directly challenged the long-standing authority of the Islamic clergy, the ulama. The religious courts, which had governed daily life for generations, were replaced by state-run secular courts. To mold the next generation, he opened schools and colleges for both boys and girls across the country, culminating in the establishment of Tehran University in 1934. Reza Shah's most controversial move, however, was his attempt to westernize the appearance of the Iranian people. He advocated for the equal participation of women in the workforce and social life, but he believed this was impossible as long as the hijab was a requirement. In 1936, he introduced the Kashfi hijab, a decree that banned the wearing of veils and headscarves in public. This was not a choice, it was enforced by the police, who would sometimes forcibly tear veils off women in the streets. While this liberated some urban, upper-class women, it deeply traumatized traditional and religious families, many of whom stopped leaving their homes altogether. Alongside this, he raised the minimum age for marriage and reformed divorce laws to give women more protection. While these reforms improved the status of women on paper, they created a massive cultural rift between the secular state and the religious heart of the country. Reza Shah's drive for secularism went further. He removed Shia Islam as the official state religion in a bid to create a purely nationalist identity. He banned trade unions, suppressed political parties, and silenced the free press. Any newspaper that dared to criticize the Shah was either shut down or coerced into becoming a mouthpiece for the monarchy. The ulama, enraged by their loss of influence and what they saw as a direct attack on Islamic values, began to organize in the shadows. But Reza Shah, intoxicated with absolute power and backed by British support, remained unfazed, using his military to silence any dissenting voices. However, the Shah eventually grew tired of British and Soviet meddling. In the 1930s, looking for a third force to balance out the influence of London and Moscow, he turned to Germany. By 1938, Nazi Germany had become Iran's largest trading partner. When World War II broke out in 1939, Iran declared its neutrality, but the Allied powers, Britain and the Soviet Union, were suspicious. They feared that Iran's vital oil refineries might fall into German hands or that the Shah might allow German agents to sabotage Allied supply lines. Iran's strategic location, known as the Persian Corridor, was the only viable route to deliver American Lend-Lease weapons to the Soviet Union to fight Hitler. When Britain demanded that Reza Shah expel all German nationals from Iran, the Shah, asserting his sovereignty, flatly refused. This defiance proved to be his undoing. In 1941, Britain and the Soviet Union launched a joint invasion of Iran. Reza Shah was forced to abdicate and was sent into exile, where he eventually died. In his place, the Allies installed his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, as the new Shah. The young Mohammad Reza Shah began his reign in a very different atmosphere. To gain public favor, he initially relaxed his father's iron grip. He abolished the mandatory kashfi hijab, giving women the freedom to choose their attire. He lifted the ban on the press and allowed political parties to form. This led to a vibrant but chaotic political scene, with the British-backed National Will Party competing against the Soviet-backed Communist Tud Party. However, the fundamental structure of the government remained unchanged. The Shah still handpicked prime ministers who were loyal to the crown, which fueled public resentment. The people wanted a leader who represented them, not the palace. This frustration reached a breaking point in 1951. Under immense public pressure, the Shah was forced to hold relatively fair elections, which saw the rise of a charismatic and staunchly nationalist lawyer named Mohammad Mossadegh. On April 28, 1951, Mossadegh was appointed prime minister. His first and most daring act was the nationalization of the Iranian oil industry. He argued that the oil belonged to the people of Iran, not a foreign corporation. He expelled the British technicians and took control of the refineries. Britain was outraged. They viewed this as a direct theft of their assets. They imposed a global naval blockade on Iranian oil and took the case to the International Court of Justice. To Britain's shock, the court eventually upheld Iran's right to nationalize its resources. Mossadegh became a global icon of anti-colonialism and a national hero in Iran. Realizing they could not defeat Mossadegh through legal or economic means, Britain began plotting a coup. Mossadegh, sensing the walls closing in, severed all diplomatic relations with Britain in October 1952. Britain's Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, realized he needed help. He initially approached US President Harry Truman, but Truman was hesitant to interfere in another country's internal affairs. However, the 1952 US election changed everything. The new president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, and his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, were far more concerned with the red menace of communism. The British convinced the Americans that if Mossadegh remained in power, Iran would eventually fall into the hands of the Soviet Union. The CIA and MI6 launched Operation Arjux. The first attempt on August 15, 1953, failed miserably when Mossadegh's loyalists caught wind of the plot. The Shah, fearing for his life, fled to Italy. But the CIA did not give up. They funneled money to paid mobs, bribed military officers, and spread black propaganda. On August 19, 1953, a second wave of protests, engineered by foreign intelligence, toppled the government. Mossadegh was arrested and placed under house arrest for the rest of his life. With Mossadegh gone, the Shah returned from exile, but he was no longer the same man. He knew he owed his throne to the United States. From 1953 onward, American influence replaced British dominance. In 1957, with the help of the CIA and Israel's Mossad, the Shah created SAVAK, the Organization of National Security and Information. SAVAK became the most feared secret police in the Middle East, known for its brutal torture and vast network of informants. Any voice of opposition was silenced before it could even speak. By the 1960s, the Shah realized that repression alone wasn't enough. He needed to modernize the economy to prevent a communist revolution. In 1963, he launched the White Revolution. This was a massive program of land reform, infrastructure development, and industrialization. He broke up the large estates of the feudal landlords and redistributed the land to the peasants. He nationalized forests and waterways and poured oil wealth into building dams, factories, and highways. On the surface, Iran was booming. The oil industry was growing at an unprecedented rate, and the Shah was being hailed in the West as a visionary leader who was turning Iran into a global power. He believed this was his masterstroke, that by providing economic prosperity, the people would forget their desire for political freedom. But beneath the shiny new factories and the rising skyscrapers of Tehran, the same old tensions were simmering. The religious leaders saw the White Revolution as a final push to destroy Islamic culture, and the middle class saw the Shah as a puppet of the American government. The stage was being set for a final, explosive confrontation. To expand this final section to 2,000 words, I have added significant detail regarding the decadence of the Persepolis celebration, the specific escalations of the 1978 protests, the psychological impact of the Cinema Rex fire, and the systematic way Khomeini consolidated power after his return. Due to Iran's increasing share of oil revenues during the 1960s and 70s, the national economy began to show signs of immense strength on the global stage. Flush with petrodollars, Mohammad Reza Shah felt he finally had the resources to transform Iran into a mirror image of a Western power. During this period, he took unprecedented steps to reshape the lives of Iranian women. He didn't just give them the right to vote, he actively encouraged them to enter professional fields like law, medicine, and engineering. Numerous schools and colleges were open to accommodate a new generation of educated women, and for the first time in many conservative provinces, boys and girls began to study together in coeducational environments. In this way, the Shah rapidly westernized Iran, but this cultural shift came at a high price. The conservatives and the religious clergy were not at all happy with these changes. They began accusing the Shah of Mossadegh, a term meaning Westoxification, arguing that he was destroying the ancient fabric of Iranian and Islamic culture to please his masters in Washington. While many urban, upper-class families embraced the change, the rural heartland felt alienated. Orthodox Muslims still wanted to rule Iran according to the holy tenets of Islam, believing that the Shah's reforms were a direct violation of divine law. Initially, the public's opposition was focused on women's rights and the immorality of Western culture, but it soon evolved into a much deeper grievance. The White Revolution did lead to significant industrial development, but the wealth was not trickling down. The gap between the ultra-rich and the working class was becoming a canyon. While the Shah's inner circle lived in unimaginable luxury, the middle class was left powerless and the poor were suffering from a housing crisis in the cities. Inflation was constantly rising, making basic goods unaffordable, and the educated youth were grappling with a lack of meaningful employment. This frustration boiled over as Iranian students took to the streets to openly raise their voices against the corruption of the Pahlavi regime. Amidst this growing unrest, a religious leader named Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini was gaining immense popularity. Unlike other clerics who stayed out of politics, Khomeini was a firebrand. He was fundamentally opposed to the Shah's modernization efforts, believing they were a front for American imperialism. In 1963, Khomeini issued a scathing manifesto against the Shah's plans, signed by 8 other senior religious scholars. Because Shia Muslims formed the majority of the population, his message resonated deeply. Fearing his influence, the Shah had Khomeini arrested and eventually exiled, first to Turkey, and then to the holy city of Najaf in Iraq. However, exile did not silence him. From Iraq, Khomeini maintained constant contact with his supporters in Iran through smuggled cassette tapes and leaflets. He introduced the revolutionary theory of velayat-e-faqih, guardianship of the jurist, which argued that in the absence of the hidden imam, the country should be governed by those most knowledgeable in Islamic law. This theory promised an end to corruption and a society where everyone would be treated equally under divine justice. As his popularity skyrocketed, even Iraq's ruler, Saddam Hussein, grew nervous. Under pressure from the Shah, Saddam eventually expelled Khomeini from Iraq in 1978, forcing him to move to a suburb of Paris. While Khomeini was building a revolutionary movement from abroad, the Shah was becoming increasingly detached from reality. In 1971, he decided to celebrate the 2500th anniversary of the Persian Empire. Despite his advisors suggesting a modest celebration in Tehran, the Shah insisted on a grand display in the desert near the ancient ruins of Persepolis. He spent an estimated $100 million, worth billions in today's currency, on what magazines called the world's most expensive party. While his people struggled with poverty, the Shah flew in chefs from Paris, served tons of caviar, and housed foreign dignitaries in air-conditioned silk tents. To the starving population, this wasn't a celebration of history, it was an insult to their dignity. By 1975, the Shah's paranoia led him to ban all political parties except his own Resurgence Party and intensify the brutality of the SAVAK secret police. Anyone who dared to whisper a word of dissent was imprisoned, tortured, or disappeared. However, the anger could not be contained forever. In 1977, a series of protests led by university students began to break out. The tension reached a fever pitch in October 1977 when Mustafa Khomeini, the Ayatollah's eldest son, died mysteriously in Iraq. The public immediately blamed the SAVAK, and mourning ceremonies across the country turned into massive political rallies. The spark that finally set the country on fire was a government-commissioned article in the Etelarat newspaper on January 7, 1978. The article slandered Khomeini, calling him a British agent and a mad Indian poet. The insult backfired spectacularly. In the religious city of Qom, thousands of students took to the streets in protest. The security forces responded with live ammunition, killing scores of people. This began a 40-day cycle of mourning and protest. Every 40 days, people would gather to honor those killed in the previous protest, only to be fired upon again, creating a new set of martyrs. On August 19, 1978, the Cinema Rex fire in Abadan shocked the nation. For militants locked the doors of a crowded movie theater and set it on fire, killing over 400 people. Although modern historians suggest Islamic radicals may have been responsible, at the time, the public was so convinced of the Shah's evil that they blamed SAVAK. This tragedy turned the unrest into a full-scale revolution. On September 8, 1978, a day known as Black Friday, the Shah imposed martial law. Unaware of the decree, thousands gathered in Jailer Square. The military opened fire, leaving the pavement soaked in blood. The death toll was in the hundreds, and any hope of a peaceful compromise died that day. By December 1978, during the holy month of Muharram, millions of people were on the streets chanting Marg Bar Shah, death to the Shah. The economy ground to a halt as oil workers went on strike. The military, once the Shah's greatest strength, began to desert in droves, unwilling to keep killing their own brothers and sisters. Even the United States, seeing the writing on the wall, began to distance itself. Realizing he had lost control of the country, the Shah, frail and suffering from cancer, fled Iran on January 16, 1979, officially for medical treatment, but everyone knew he would never return. The atmosphere in Tehran was electric. On February 1, 1979, the Air France jet carrying Ayatollah Khomeini touched down at Mehrabad Airport. Millions of people lined the streets for miles, crying and cheering. He was welcomed not just as a religious leader, but as a liberator. Upon his return, he immediately declared the Shah's appointed government illegal. While the revolution had been a broad coalition of Marxists, liberals, and Islamists, Khomeini moved quickly to consolidate power. One by one, the secular and left-wing groups that had fought alongside the religious faction were sidelined, arrested, or executed. In March 1979, a national referendum was held. With a staggering 98% of the vote, Iran was declared an Islamic republic. A new constitution was drafted, based on Khomeini's vision of Velayat-e Faqih. It established a parliament and a president, but placed ultimate power in the hands of a supreme leader, a position Khomeini would hold for life. The supreme leader was given the authority to command the armed forces, appoint the heads of the judiciary, and veto any law deemed UN Islamic. To ensure the survival of the new system, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, was formed, serving as a shadow military dedicated solely to protecting the revolution. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 didn't just change a government, it changed the world. It ended 2,500 years of Persian monarchy and replaced it with a unique form of theocratic governance that continues to define West Asian politics today. The government remains governed by Sharia law, and the structures built by Khomeini in those chaotic months of 1979 remain the bedrock of the modern Iranian state.